focus too much on that. Let's think about normal situations. And we used to actually do this in lab with some pretty sophisticated equipment. Now I think they've changed their ways a little bit. But you'll do some of this in lab. I don't think it graphs it out like it used to. But we don't need that. We can do a spirograph just with chalk and me kind of talking you through it. So in a medical evaluation, often, especially if somebody's professionals are concerned about a person's lung function, they'll hook them up to a machine called a spirometer, and basically the spring goes in your mouth like that, and you breathe in and out through this tube, and it records how much air goes in and out of your mouth. Or plug your nose up. So they get a notion of volumes. I had to do this a bunch of years ago, and I've been a diver since the 80s. It's a long time. But then my employer, so if I was going to be diving as part of my job, we had to all get medically evaluated. So we went to somewhere that does this kind of thing. And they hooked us up, and they had us breathe like in and out. So your normal breaths, like you're doing right now, they're just kind of like that. And this is volumes over here. So volume of air on your up and down axis. So you're breathing along, like you're doing now, just kind of like in and out, in and out. That's called tidal volume. Okay, so the distance between this up and down, it's time here on the bottom. The distance between up and down is a volume. So you breathe out, you breathe in, and that's called tidal volume. I'll write them over here too. TV is tidal, T-I-D-A-L, volume. Like tides at the beach, they go up and they go down a little bit. That's normal breaths. And those run usually about, in a normal, healthy adult male, about 500 milliliters is your tidal volume. And that's, one of those water bottles that you carry around. Those are usually about 500 mLs or so. And then there's other volumes that happen. So we'll take this away, and we're gonna blow out birthday candles. So you're breathing, and then you go just as high as you can. The distance between the distance between how far you normally breathe in and how far you can breathe in, that's called inspiratory reserve volume. So inspiratory, IRV, inspiratory, oops, it should be an N in there, right? I-N, inspiratory. Actually, it has the word spirit in it. And this is why this course should get, you should get GE credit for this, because of all the extra history and religion and stuff I give you. All you have to do is take A&P, and that should do it for your college career. But actually, there's a reason for that. That's not a coincidence. Ancient people often would associate breath with spirit. And there's even like passages in the Bible where it talks about God breathing spirit into the person or I think there's one in the New Testament about Jesus breathed on the disciples and promised them this spiritual awakening. So inspiratory, that's how much you breathe in beyond what you normally can breathe in. And that's really quite a large volume. Around 3,000 milliliters of air can be breathed in like that by a normal, healthy adult young person. All of these numbers, by the way, are subject to change depending upon age, disease state, height, weight, you name it, genetics. Okay, so you breathe in, and then you go, and you breathe out as far as you can. Maybe that's why nobody sits in the front row anymore, because mine get wet. The distance between how far you normally breathe out and how far you can breathe out, that's the expiratory reserve volume, ERV, expiratory. Reserve volume. And that works out to be around 1,000 milliliters of air. Then there's this other little bit that's down here. So, okay, so you get done blowing out your birthday candles and you go back up and you breathe normally again, yeah? This just keeps it going on. But there's this distance here between there's still air in there. I can't get it out, but it's still there. Right? The only way you could get this out, this is called RV, residual volume. Residual volume runs around 1,200 milliliters in most people. A part of that is because your air sacs don't collapse all the way. When you're squeezing as tight as you can, you still can't squeeze them completely empty. Also, you have all those little bronchial tubes, big bronchial tubes, trachea that just don't want to collapse. Thank goodness. There's this, here's your political science and history for the day. You know, there's that part in the US Constitution that prohibits cruel and unusual punishments. That's because the colonists had experience with cruel and unusual punishments that the British at the time would impose on people. Like, for example, they lay you on a table, they put a board on your chest, and they start putting bricks on it, and they say, "Did you steal that cow?" "No." "Brick." "Did you steal the cow?" "No." "Brick." They kept piling rocks on top until finally the person's chest would collapse. And then they'd get that residual, they'd get to find out how much there was. And that would obviously kill you too. The residual volume is always there. It's dead airspace that you're just stuck with. Now there's one time in your life when you get to have a full lung of air that's all fresh. There's just one time. And that's when you pop out a mom. You know, the head comes up first, then the shoulders, then the chest. Once the chest clears the birth canal, most of it happens pretty rapidly after that. The doc or the nurse takes the kid and they hold him upside down, and sometimes they have to swat him on the butt. When they come out, they go, and then the first thing you do with this lung of air that you're never going to get again is you bitch about it. You cry, right? Now, how stupid is that? Now, this is going to come into play here later on. We're going to think about the expiratory reserve volume and the residual volume here in a minute, okay? When we talk about the physiology of breathing, the physiology of external respiration. Okay, so we have these air sacs in our lungs that are the sites of gas exchange. So here's our nose, here's our tube, and there's our air sac. Now, as I said before, there's a lot of branching goes on. There's all this anatomical detail. But this represents the conducting zone. All this here, that's just pipe. And then the one air sac represents the alveoli. So this is one alveolus, but we're thinking about all the alveoli. Okay. Often in physiology, what they like to do is break down the physiological process and understand how it works at the functional unit level. The functional unit of gas exchange is the alveolus. When we talk about, well, in first semester, when you talked about skeletal muscle contraction, you thought about one muscle cell, like just one, but realize there's millions of them, right? So if you can get this, you understand how they all work. So that's our alveolus. And the alveolus is the only place where gases are exchanged in the respiratory system. The air in your trachea, the air in your bronchial tubes, the air in your nose does not exchange with blood worth a hoot. Any significant amount of movement of gases occurs across the walls of the alveoli. Okay? So that's a really important point. Now, what we're going to have to do here is a little bit of, and it's just a little bit, of chemistry and physics. Move this card so I don't forget to talk about it. We're going to do a little bit with chemistry and physics. And we're going to imagine that air has two gases in it. It has more than that. Actually, there's a lot of gases in here. But these two gases, nitrogen, N2, and oxygen, they constitute almost all the volume of air. And then there's a little bit that's made up of other things. So we're just going to assume right now that there's these two gases. And percentage-wise, oxygen constitutes 21% of the gases in dry air. And nitrogen constitutes, we'll say, to make it add up right, we'll say 79%. So this is a bit of a fiction, but you know, it'll work for now. You can always make things more complicated. Now, if you were in Miami, for one thing, there would be no ice out there on that lake, and it would be beautiful. And a shirt like this would not look out of place at all. I have a lot of these, so you might expect to see others. The amount of pressure that's pushing down on you from the atmosphere at sea level is going to be about 760 millimeters of mercury. So when you listen to the weather report, if you're in Miami, and they said the barometric pressure today is 31.39 inches, right? That's a way of expressing air pressure. In the United States, we use the old English system of measurement. They talk about barometric pressure in inches of mercury. That's what they mean when they say barometric pressure is 31.59 or whatever. Well, when you convert inches into the metric system, which is what almost all the rest of the world uses, you get something around 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level. Okay, and it goes up and it goes down a little bit depending upon weather patterns and stuff, but that's a pretty good average. Okay, so the thing we're going to need to do is we need to, first of all, calculate what's called the partial pressure of oxygen. We're going to put it in that box right there. And this is really easy to do. So you might want to make yourself a note at the next exam, bring yourself a little calculator. Otherwise, you're going to have to use the one that I give you. It runs on kerosene. Okay, so what you do is you take 760, that's the total atmospheric pressure, and you multiply it times 0.21. So if you can calculate the sale price of a sweater at Kohl's, you can do this, just a percentage. And what you get is about 160 millimeters of mercury. That's the partial pressure of oxygen in this particular example. Now you could do the same thing to get nitrogen. You could take 760, multiply it times 0.79, and you would get a different number. Another way to do it would be to take 760 minus 160, and you would get 600. But honestly, for A&P, you don't need to do that because you don't care about nitrogen. All you care about is oxygen. Nitrogen, for our purposes, at sea level or above, nitrogen is inert. Like regular N2 gas doesn't do anything. It does matter sometimes. Divers, for example, scuba divers found out when they started fooling around with self-contained underwater breathing apparatus in the 1950s, 45 through 50s, that they were trying to. These were macho men, and they were trying to like I went down to 400 feet. I went down to 420. I mean, smoking cigarettes, eating steak, raw steak, slugging down whiskey, and just go out there and just do it deeper and deeper and deeper, and then one day one of them doesn't come back. Wonder what happened to Joe. Well, what happens one of the things that happens to divers when they go too deep and they breathe regular compressed atmospheric air, is that nitrogen starts to mess up their neurotransmitters in their brain, and they start to hallucinate. They talk about people taking the regulator out of their mouth and trying to give it to the passing fish because the poor fish is drowning. Like these kind of thoughts would happen to people, or they would stop believing their bubbles. Like when you're underwater, which way is up? Whatever way the bubbles are going is up. Every diver knows that. And when you stop believing your bubbles, you got problems. They call that nitrogen narcosis. So actually nitrogen can be a problem, but at surface and above, like most of us live, all you have to worry about, especially for things like a test, is to be able to calculate the partial pressure of oxygen. Now that amount, 160 millimeters of mercury, constitutes, in a sense, the concentration of oxygen. So you remember, diffusion is the movement of something from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And we're going to measure oxygen concentrations in that unit, millimeters of mercury. So think of this as a kind of concentration. It's really not, but for our purposes, that's going to work. That's the amount of oxygen out here in the room air that's going in the schnoz hole. And then it's going to go down these here tubes, and it's going to wind up in this alveolus. Now, this alveolus is not the alveolus of a brand new baby. This is an old guy. This could be a day-old baby. This could be somebody in their 20s. There's going to be, when this new air comes in and it hits the alveolus, it's going to encounter old air. So there's new air and there's old air that's going to wind up mixing in the alveolus, right? And that's the concentration that we're going to be concerned about. So we have a new problem to answer. It's a mathematical problem, but it's a pretty easy one. And that is, once this new air comes in and it mixes with the old, what's the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen? This is the atmospheric partial pressure of oxygen, 160. But what's the partial pressure of oxygen within the alveolus? And to make this work out, I have to give you what we lovingly call in science a fudge factor. I'm just going to give you a number to multiply by, and that's going to constitute your fudge factor. It'll make the numbers work out. And it's physiologically, it's a pretty good rule of thumb. So during a normal sort of breath, tidal volumes going on, you've got some expiratory reserve volume, you've got some residual volume, you've taken some air in. A pretty good rule of thumb is to take your atmospheric partial pressure of oxygen, multiply it times 0.65. Okay, 0.65. And I would give you that on an exam. Okay, you don't have to necessarily memorize it. It's not a hard one to learn, but that would be one that I would be able to give you. And when you do that, take 160 times 0.65, you get something around 104 millimeters of mercury. That is the alveolar partial pressure that we're going to use. 104 millimeters of mercury is what's in the alveolus, using the numbers that I've given you. Now, there's an important thing to notice that I would say almost always, okay, just about always, okay, always, the atmospheric partial pressure is always going to be bigger than what's in the alveolus. Because of that stale air effect, it's always going to encounter some old air when it comes in, and that's going to lower the partial pressure. So we've got 160 out there on the outside, 104 on the inside, and now we have to draw in something new. And this is a pulmonary capillary. Pulmonary capillary, of course, has blood in it. And the blood is coming from the heart and going back to the heart. We'll talk, when we look at circulation, we'll see, which chambers and valves and all that's involved. But for right now, just realize you've got some blood and it's flowing past the alveolus. In fact, I've drawn this way too simply. What this thing really looks like is an air sac with capillaries just wrapped all around it, like a ball of yarn. Really, really just covered with capillaries. But for this purpose, we'll just have it be one, like it's a little highway. And as the blood comes from the heart, realize that blood has, before it hit the heart, it was out in the body doing stuff, like visiting all the organs. And when it visits all the organs, things like muscles and kidney and spleen and all that, those organs extract oxygen from the blood while it's circulating. So when the blood gets back to the heart, a lot of the oxygen has been removed. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood coming from the heart toward the alveolus runs around 40 millimeters of mercury as a partial pressure. And that actually stays, I wouldn't say absolutely constant, but fluctuates. It goes up and down. But it's pretty remarkably accurate to say that it's in the neighborhood of 40. Whether you're talking about a human, a horse, a squid, a tuna, all animals seem to do that to their blood. They remove all the oxygen, but about 40 millimeters of mercury. And as it goes along through the pipe, it's 40, it's 40, it's 40, and then it gets really close to the alveolus, like within just microns of the alveolus. And when it's that close, it looks across the garden fence and it goes, whoa, the grass really is greener over there. The oxygen concentration really is higher over there. When you see a difference across a small distance, that big, now you can have diffusion. And we can actually calculate what's called the diffusion gradient. The diffusion gradient is really easy to figure out. All you do is find the difference between the alveolar partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of oxygen that's in the blood. So you take, in this case, 104 minus 40, and that gives you 64. That's your diffusion gradient. Okay. That's the important number. The diffusion gradient is what tells diffusion how fast to go. The greater the diffusion gradient, the faster diffusion will go. The lower the diffusion gradient, the slower diffusion will go. It's like pushing on the foot feed in your car. You know, it's like makes the engine race, push it all the way down. This tells diffusion how fast to go. Now, heaven forbid, your alveolar partial pressure today, or anytime soon, becomes 40. Like, what if that was 40 in there? What if we changed that? For whatever reason, that became 40. It would be 40 minus 40 equals 0. And you die. You suffocate. You don't have any new oxygen entering your blood. Okay. So the bigger this number can be, the faster your diffusion can take place. Now, normally we don't have to worry about that too much until, or unless, we move. Like, is it Tuesday? Yeah, my daughter's back. She went to Denver the other day, visit some friends, and you go somewhere up in the mountains, at higher elevation, well, that pressure changes. I've got a good example here I was going to give you. Here we are. Let's see it. Okay, so here, this is your geography part of A&P. Going to go to Ecuador, capital city of Ecuador. It's a place called Quito. It's in It's in South America. Elevation, 10,000 feet above sea level. It's 2 miles up. I went there maybe 2000 or so. Yeah, so about 16 years ago. And we flew Fort Wayne to Miami, Miami to direct flight, Miami to Quito. Got off the plane. I got, like a book bag and a suitcase. And I'm like, and I was a lot younger then. Headache, like wanted to puke. Altitude got to me. This happens frequently with people that go to high elevations. Why is that? Because at high elevation like that, the atmospheric pressure was quite a bit lower than at sea level. Even, Fort Wayne is 800 feet above sea level, so we're not really that high compared to somebody like Ecuador. So let's work through this little calculation again. It'll give you a little bit of practice, and it'll reinforce a couple things we've talked about. So we take 523, multiply it times 21, and we're going to get a new partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere of 110 millimeters of mercury. So that number in the box is what we put over here. It's going to go in the nose. 110 millimeters going in. Take that and multiply it out times 65%, 0.065 times 110, and you're going to get something more like 72 millimeters of mercury. So simply by changing altitude, we've changed the alveolar partial pressure down to 72 millimeters of mercury. And again, when you do the arithmetic, you take 72, subtract 40 from it. That's 32 millimeters of mercury as our diffusion gradient. It was 64 in Miami. It's 32 in Quito. Half. Like, that's a lot. That's half the amount of oxygen available. So that just picking up a suitcase and walking off the airplane is enough to make you want to lose your cookies. All right, so what else do I want to tell you about? Oh, before I leave the alveolus, I want to talk just a little bit about what it's made of. I don't want to forget about that. So I get rid of some of these numbers. Before I do that, any questions about what I just did? What would biology be if we didn't talk about cells a little bit, right? Let's talk about cells. The cells that make up the walls of the alveoli are old friends of yours for the most part. These cells are simple squamous epithelium cells. Simple squamous epithelium. Almost all of them are flat, shaped like pancakes, really thin. And that provides as small a distance as possible for oxygen to move out of the alveolus and into the blood. And the walls of the pulmonary capillaries, they're made of, for the most part, simple squamous epithelium, really thin, pancake-shaped cells. So the distance that oxygen has to diffuse across is 1-2 cell layers and a little bit of fluid, a little bit of interstitial fluid between them. So much less than the thickness of a piece of paper. And that's what diffusion likes, doesn't like crossing great distances. Another kind of cell in the alveolus is a cuboidal cell. It's much thicker. So that's simple cuboidal epithelium. And that cell produces something called surfactants. Surfactant is basically like a little bit of soap. You know, you put soap in the water to break down the surface tension, make it easier for the water to get to the dishes. It's the same idea here. When I was a kid, I went to summer camp, and we were cruel little guys, and we'd fill a bucket or something with water, and then we'd catch daddy long-legs, and we'd put them on there, and they, you got those long legs, and they like kind of stand on the water like, because they're not really water bugs, they're crawl around on trees. And then one of us figured out, it was not me, one of us figured out that if you put a few drops of like dishwashing detergent in there, it would break the surface film and it would fall and drown in the bottom. That's a lot of fun. That's what surfactant does. It breaks down the surface tension on water. So it keeps the water that covers the inside of the alveolus from collapsing the air sacs. These are very, very tiny. And at very small sizes, water tension is a huge force. I think there was a movie some years ago where it might have been the one with the ants in it, and an ant got like stuck in a drop of water or something, had trouble getting out. That's the kind of forces that we're talking about. We don't normally think of them because we're so big. But when you're really little, surface tension of water is a tremendous force. Well, this surfactant stuff coats the inside of the alveoli, and it prevents the alveoli from collapsing. Clinically speaking, surfactant is actually used in like premature baby situations where they'll have to artificially administer surfactant if the baby's not developed to the point where its cuboidal cells have the ability to produce it. One more cell that I want to talk about that's in your alveoli looks like an amoeba. That one looks like a bunny, actually. Yeah. It's like a bunny. This is called a macrophage. This is an alveolar macrophage. I don't think we've seen these guys yet. Macrophage, macro means big, phage means eater. It eats stuff. This is a big eater. It's a cell that crawls around on the inside of the air sacs and looks for foreign organisms to eat. Things like bacteria and fungi, protozoans, anything that doesn't belong in your air sacs. These macrophages, these alveolar macrophages, it's their assignment to locate them and destroy them. So, we talked about your conducting zone, all of those parts of your pharynx and your upper respiratory system that's designed to filter the air, moisten the air, warm the air, get all the bad stuff out. Even with that, there's still occasionally things that get through. And the macrophages are sort of your last line of defense against respiratory infections. All right, let's see. One of my many problems, believe me, I have a lot, is I'm teaching 2 classes this semester. One is this one, A&P. Actually, I'm teaching 4 classes, but these 2 are very similar. One is called vertebrate physiology, and it's for the biology majors, and I go about 4 times as fast, and I cover a lot more material, and I'm looking at notes for both classes right now, so I want to make sure I give you what I owe you, but not too much. Okay, that's good, that's good. Nice. We're not going to talk about birds, or crocodiles, or snakes. That was a good one. I wish I could tell you about that, but that's a good class. Hear about it. That looks fine. No fish gills. Not going to do that. So interesting, though. Oh, man. Oxygen concentration in the Paleozoic era. I'll tell you. This is supposed to make you feel better. Okay, so I think a couple clinical applications might be nice. One is what happens when people get sick and these spaces here get bigger, like the distance between the blood vessel and the air. It can be caused by an increase in fluid you can have pulmonary edema, which would tend to separate, this little thin space of fluid in there. What if it was a lot wider? Well, that would make diffusion go slower, yeah? That would be a problem. Another problem that you could have would be if you have difficulty exchanging air with the environment. You can't take as deep a breath. That's another possible problem. I talked about these percentages over here as though they were like written in stone somewhere, and they're really not. I mean, it turns out this day and age, just about anywhere you go on Earth, as long as there's a connection to the outside through ventilation or an open window, if these percentages stay the same. But it is possible to boost the concentration of oxygen, and this is done all the time in a clinical setting. They'll put a cannula in the person's nose, turn up the pure medical oxygen, and you can actually increase the percentage of oxygen that's being delivered to the alveolus. Okay, that'll bring the alveolar partial pressure back up again. That's a treatment for things like emphysema and COPD. Another thing that can happen, as we said, is you can move and go to a higher elevation, like happened here. We went to Quito, Ecuador. Well, when you do that, your body can compensate. So we're going to call these physiological compensation mechanisms. In other words, these are three ways that your body deals with having less oxygen to work with. And the first one I already described, and it happens right away. And that is an increase in the depth and the frequency of ventilation. In other words, you breathe faster and deeper right away. Your body notices that you don't have as much oxygen going circulating through your arteries. So your brain sends a message to the muscles that control your breathing, your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles, and you go. You've all done this, right? Whenever you're kind of short of breath, you increase. That's the first and immediate physiological compensation mechanism. What that does is it increases the percentage of new air in your alveoli. And that's going to change how much effectively your alveolar partial pressure is. So that's going to help increase the depth and frequency of ventilation. Number two is an increase in the number of erythrocytes, or red blood cells. Now this one takes a little while. This is more like days to weeks in order to ramp up the number of red blood cells that you have circulating in your bloodstream. Your kidneys, as we've said before, have the ability to get by for a while with limited amount of oxygen. So, while your brain and your heart, they need oxygen all the time, your kidneys can get by with less. And when your kidneys experience low oxygen concentration, they produce EPO. So the kidneys make erythropoietin, which we talked about when we did the hormones. And then EPO goes to the red bone marrow and causes your red bone marrow to make more red blood cells. So the problem is you don't have enough oxygen getting to your tissues. A solution to that is increase the amount of hemoglobin, the amount of red blood cells circulating in your blood to get more ability to move oxygen from place to place. So that's the second physiological compensation mechanism, and it takes a few days to, on the order of weeks, for that to happen. So my daughter was only in Denver for 4 days. She didn't really have time to boost her red blood cells while she was out there. The U.S. Olympic team actually trains in Colorado in part to take advantage of this. The athletes training at high elevations will develop more red blood cells, and that increases their athletic ability. A third physiological compensation is an increase in the number of alveoli. The number of air sacs increases. So if you move to Denver and you stay there for years, you actually will grow more air sacs, which increases the amount of surface area that's available to absorb oxygen. Okay. This even works across generations. People that live in the high Andes Mountains in South America, scientists have studied these native peoples for a while, and they have respiratory volumes like 2 or 3 times greater than people like us that live at low elevations. They've actually adapted to that over generations. So you have to really be there for a long time for that to help out. Okay, so that's it for today. We'll pick up on Wednesday with transport.